What the Egyptians ate and drank might surprise you, because there's a very interesting cultural reference to Egyptian bread in the book of Exodus. Stay tuned and find out on today's episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. So anyway, we're going to talk today a little bit about what the Egyptians ate and drank, specifically beer. Yeah, Freudian slip, bread.
That works. Actually, that works pretty darn well. Leave this whole segment, including my comments, in. Have your own blooper reel. What really goes on in the
okay.
What Egyptians ate and drank? Beer. Sorry, Freudian slip, because it's so stinking hot, I wouldn't eat anything.
It is stinking hot right now in Vancouver, and nothing would be better right now than a cold beer. And it's not so much a Freudian slip, because the Egyptians connected beer and bread. The two were related. And if anything, beer is nothing but drinkable bread. But for today's video, we're just going to focus on bread. Now, if you like this video and want to help out this channel, please hit that subscribe button. It really, really helps. And I want to thank all you who've recently subscribed to the channel. A special shout out to Emily, who has just recently subscribed. Thank you very much. It really helps. Okay, so since its earliest days, Egypt cultivated grains, particularly barley and wheat. And these two grains were ubiquitous across the ancient Near East. Now, in ancient Israel, barley was the grain of choice. It was dependable. It was reliable. It always produced a crop. But the problem with barley was that it was vitamin A deficient. So if you ate primarily barley over time, you went blind. And much of the blindness in the ancient Near East was caused by a diet that was primarily composed of barley. Now, wheat, on the other hand, was rich in vitamin A. It's delicious. And when it produces a bumper crop. But the problem is, it didn't always produce a crop. So it was sort of a feast and famine situation. If your wheat crop succeeded, you got a bumper crop. If it failed, you got nothing at all. So in places like the Levant, where they grew both barley and wheat, the choice was kind of between starvation and blindness, which was not a great choice. But in Egypt, the situation was different. Egypt had an annual flood that covered all the agricultural land with not just a rich silt that replenished the soil, but it also hydrated all the land. So growing wheat was really reliable in Egypt, and it was the grain of choice. Almost everyone except for the most poorest of people ate wheat. But they still grew barley. And the question is, if you've got this abundance of wheat, why grow barley at all? And it comes down to one quality that barley has that wheat doesn't, which is something called diastatic power. Diastatic power is a set of enzymes, alpha and beta amylase, that convert starch to sugar. Now, why would you need this? The reason is because if you want to make beer, you have to convert starches to sugars. And that's what they did with the barley, is they malted it and turned it into beer. Now, beer is a topic for another video, which we will be doing. We will be making Egyptian-style beer. But today we're going to focus only on the bread, because the bread is sort of the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet. So, what did the Egyptians do with the grains that they produced? Well, most of the grains in ancient Egypt, the barley and the wheat, went to the temples. And they were made into loaves that were presented to the gods as food offerings. Okay, so the grain, when it arrived at the temple, was malted, dried, and ground into a coarse powder with a millstone. Millstones are interesting because they varied in size between, say, your home model versus your temple model. Now, a home model millstone might be about 8 inches, and it was meant to serve a single family. But the millstones at temples could be 6 feet across and would have been moved by, say, donkeys or oxen to grind grain at an industrial level to produce these offering loaves. And we find one such millstone at Dendara Temple that's nearly 6 feet across. It's massive. Now, as a bit of experimental archaeology, I made some offering loaves. And here is my example of a offering loaf. As you can see, it's small, round, flat on one side, and you can see they look kind of like the T hieroglyph. Now, I'm going to taste one of these. So, let's just break it open. It's actually softer than it looks. And it tastes horrible. These things don't have any leavening in it. They're basically nothing but a cake of barley, malted or otherwise. Yeah, they're really bland. But they're not meant to be eaten by people. At least not in this stage. They were meant to be given as food offerings to the gods. Now, once they were given as food offerings, the priests then collected the loaves and distributed them. And once they were distributed, the people then took the loaves and then either they ground them down further and produced edible bread or turned them into beer. Now, when they wanted to make bread out of these loaves, what they did was they took these loaves, broke them up, used their home millstones to make the fine flour. They would mix a sourdough culture, which is relatively easy to make. And then they would knead the dough and stick the dough in these tall bread bowls. They would take the dough with the bread bowl, the whole thing together, and put them in an oven to bake. So the dough and the bread bowl together went in the oven. When they were done, the bread was removed, and the bread bowl was actually broken. It was shattered. And the chips of the mold were then removed, discarded, and then they ate the bread. Now, the question is, what do you do if there's a chip of bread bowl in your bread? Will you spit it out? I mean, the human tongue is actually pretty sensitive to this thing. If you had a big rock in your mouth, you'd notice it pretty quickly. So it didn't actually affect the quality of the bread. But this leads to a very interesting question, which is that the bread bowls in Egypt are very, very different than, say, the bread bowls in the rest of the ancient Near East. Bread bowls in Israel and the Levant are actually short, flat, concave bread bowls. The bread bowls of ancient Egypt are tall, thin cylinders that stood upright in the ovens. Okay? Different method of making bread. But this leads us to a very interesting reference in the book of Exodus. As the Israelites are leaving Egypt, we find this very peculiar statement in Exodus chapter 12, which reads, "So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their bread bowls bound in their clothes on their shoulders." Exodus 12:34. Now, if we were talking about an Israelite or a Levantine bread bowl, that passage doesn't make a lot of sense, because they're short, flat bowls. The dough wouldn't sit in them. They would be, if they bound up that bread bowl on their shoulders, the dough would be pressing into their backs. But the Egyptians had a very unique custom, which was for tall cylindrical objects. They would bind them into the clothing over their shoulders. And you can see in the drawing that I'm going to show you here, a priest with a scroll bound up in his clothing on his shoulders. So if we take the Egyptian carrying custom of carrying cylindrical objects on their shoulders, with the fact that Egyptian bread bowls are in fact tall cylinders, then the Israelites leaving Egypt with their bread bound up in the clothing on their shoulders makes perfect sense. And frankly, this passage doesn't make sense if we don't take this in its Egyptian context. Well, that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed our little foray into the discussion on Egyptian bread. Thank you for watching, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Thank you.